15 seconds. Cool. With POIs between 1 minute and 6 minutes. I'm not going to like time or clap or like put any reaction. Please just time yourselves. I will try to cut you off if you go over time. Without further ado, I'd like to invite up the Prime Minister to begin the debate. This House believes that China's rapid expansion of electric vehicles industry has done more harm than good. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Great. POIs in the chat, please. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Corporations like BYD has been able to create a monopoly of the entire market of electric vehicle by the support of Chinese government investing hugely to that single corporations. I think other corporations within other countries from the United States like Tesla or Toyota from Japan, for instance, has not been able to compete with BYD. It's only the BYD completely monopolizing the market and able to manipulate the market as they want to do on their side of the house. I think it creates worse environment for consumers, but also the fact that the adoption of electric vehicles is likely to get slower on their side of the house simply worsen the environment as a whole. From all of these reasons, very happy to propose. The single argumentation coming from opening government is simple. Why China was able and BYD was able to create monopoly of electric vehicle industry and why that is bad. And we're also going to talk about the comparative as to how like competition is likely to have worked without this. So first then, why China was able to create a monopoly of electric vehicle industry to begin with. The first mechanization that I want to present to you is to prove to you as to why China and BYD was able to completely monopolize the entire electric vehicle that exists under status quo. The first thing I want to note here is China and BYD had the first mover advantage. That is, in order for you to create electric vehicle, the existing technology on fuel engine cars was not necessarily applicable to begin with, because all of the function with like mechanical function of fuel engine car was necessarily not applicable to electric cars. Like I'm an engineering student, so believe what I'm talking about. Therefore, other like traditional Toyota or Benz did not necessarily have outcompeting technology out compared to BYD. The fact that BYD and China as a whole were able to get cheaper natural resources was the reason why they are able to create first mover advantage, because electric vehicles requires huge amount of natural resources compared to the fuel engines, which only requires metals at best. That looks like rare earth mineral being able to be excavated domestically, for instance, which is necessarily going to be used for batteries and batteries and the function and the PC function of the electric vehicles. That also look like being able to get lead essential for batteries from Congo, because of the fact that China was able to create BRI environment, the fact that they are able to create semiconductor within their own country, all of these facts means that they were able to get all of those natural resources cheaply. And the thing to note here is that Chinese government thought that this electric vehicle industry was a strategic industry that China could outcompete other countries, and therefore they gave BYD preferential treatment for that, so that they were able to access all of these supply chains much in a cheaper price compared to other corporations. The second thing I want to note here is that Chinese government had an incentive to massively support this industry as a whole. What does it look like? It looked like providing subsidy to people on the ground and to the corporations, so they were able to lower the price of the vehicles, for instance, which was really which created bad effect to other countries, given that the BYD was able to dump that car at a super cheaper price compared to other competitors, and therefore a lot of consumers bought that. Even compared with fuel engines cars, the price of that electric vehicles coming from BYD was cheap, and that was the reason why they were able to completely monopolize the entire domestic domestic market in other countries. But second of all, I think they provided tax evasion to BYD, so they were able to create profit like every year, for instance, and therefore foreign direct investment were able to do hugely invest in BYD, given that the how do you say, the achievement and the amount of revenue that BYD was able to create was massive on their side of the house. But last of all, I think using the huge amount of capital that they were able to amass and using the huge amount of capital that Chinese government gave, for instance, they did a lot of emergent acquisition so that they were able to possess green technology to begin with. And the thing to note here is that yes, they were able to amass and collect huge amount of green technology which other corporations cannot access to begin with. But the thing is, BYD did not necessarily have the incentive to apply those technologies to make the cars cheaper. Because of the fact that there were less competition, because of the fact that Tesla's car was shit, they didn't necessarily need to apply all of those technologies, use huge amount of cost, for instance, to make that car much more effective in a technological way. What is the implications here? I think all of the EV, I think under status quo, 95% of EV cars are being sold from BYD. And note, the other competitors were likely to be kicked out from the competitors to begin with. Because under status quo, the price of electric vehicle is essential in the current market because that is how people evaluate cars under the status quo. It's not about how cool it is, for instance, but most of the time, the way people decide what car to buy to begin with is oftentimes decided by the price, because obviously buying car is really expensive. You want to cut that price as much as you want to do, but also you require a lot of money to maintain your car. So obviously the initial cost, you want to make the initial cost really lower. That's why Tesla is shit. Tesla is outcompeted under status quo. What are the implications here? But before that, closing.
Yeah, if the car is gonna be cheap on outside of house, isn't that a good thing? Because more people can access the EV car, which is important.
Implications to threefolds. First of all, there's going to be less competition, meaning less mechanical advancement will happen to electric vehicles. And I'm going to argue on this status quo that electric vehicles is shit right now, because the amount of the length that electric vehicle can run is really limited. The amount of charging speed, it requires to fully charge your car is also, it takes a huge amount of time, for instance. The effectiveness of those electric vehicle is also shit as well. But the second thing I want to note here, which engages with the case that Atsuki-san pointed out, is that China and BYD is able to jack up prices after they were able to monopolize the market. And that is the reason why China and BYD try to make the price of the EV car really low as possible, so that they are able to outcompete other corporations, so that other corporations won't even think about competing with BYD to begin with. And given that BYD is actually able to, for instance, M&A all of those corporations that have technological green technology, for instance, that is the reason why it's going to be harder for other corporations to come in when BYD jack up prices to begin with. But the last thing I want to note here, which is also crucial, is that I think US and EU are unlikely to adopt EV cars on their side of the house, because obviously they do understand that BYD becomes a strategic point for for China to grow its hegemony around the globe, which means I think under the status quo, US and EU is trying to promote those EV car, because obviously using EV car is probably environmentally friendly compared to using fuel engines car. But the thing is, as long as United States and EU understand that this is just promoting China's hegemony around the world, I think that is the point that they're going to stop providing subsidy to people on the ground, for instance, stop the regulations that prohibits the usage of fuel engine cars in the 2050, for instance, which means all in all, I think all of those environmental workage is less likely to be worse on our side of the house. I think comparatively speaking, if Benz, Toyota, and like Tesla are able to outcompete with each other, that's the way in which you are able to get much more better EV car on our side of the house, but also going to have a much more healthier condition, which also lowers the price of the cars. From all of these reasons, very happy to propose.
Cool. I'd like to thank Prime Minister for that speech, and to begin the opposition venture debate, I'd like to invite up leader of opposition. Here.
Hi, I just want to confirm, am I audible and visible?
Yep.
Awesome. Give me 1 second, I'll start my speech. The biggest competitor of the electric vehicle is now and has always been petrol cars, not other electric vehicles. This is a growing industry. The market share that BYD, that Gov wants to claim is some massive monopoly, has claimed off of other companies has not been off of other electric vehicle companies because that market share simply did not exist at the point which BYD entered into the market. They won that market share of petrol cars, which is a benefit regardless of whether or not it's a monopoly because it massively decreases emissions. And it has massively increased the EV market. Cool. One super simple argument from OO. There are more EVs, they are better, and they are cheaper. Okay, let's start by characterizing why in the counterfactual another country would not have moved in and only China could do the type of rapid expansion that enables it to create some cheap, good EVs that are able to win this market share off of petrol cars. Some of this may sound similar to what OG told you because apparently they think it proves their point. But one, they have economies of scale, and that's super important because they need to outcompete the only other EV in the market, Tesla, to start winning that market share, to start becoming established. And that means they're able to produce things much cheaper. Number two, there is extremely cheap labor in China. That's really important because a huge amount of labor goes into producing a car. And other countries, like Western countries, don't have the same type of cheap labor. And that means China has a competitive advantage over Western countries. Third thing then, the stability of China makes it very attractive to investors. Note that other countries that have cheap labor often are very unstable because they're developing countries that are often have conflicts. They often have far more fraught economic situations, whereas China has a strong, stable economy. That makes it particularly attractive. That means China is uniquely the only country that exists at the intersection of the economy of scale, the cheap labor it can provide, and the stability it provides to investors. That means China is uniquely placed to be able to move into the EV market and be successful. And any other country or any other brand from a different country would not be able to move into the market and be similarly successful in winning market share off of petrol cars, which is the most important thing in this debate. Number four, they have the incentive because of the Chinese government's pro-climate action platform. Number five, that means they get government grants and subsidies, which means they're able to do things like kickstart innovation and start the process in a way that uniquely companies in other countries are not. And finally, they have access to just a lot of the raw materials, as we heard in OG's speech. That means that in the counterfactual, you don't get the same winning of market share off of petrol cars because EVs are more expensive, they're worse, and they enter less quickly. That means you get more people using petrol cars for longer, you get more emissions. And no, the counterfactual is also just the EV market is not a bunch of small companies all competing with each other. It's Tesla owns the monopoly of EVs, and they're incredibly rare because Tesla prices them as a luxury good and tries to maintain exclusivity. That means EVs are only bought by particularly wealthy people, they're not accessible to most people, and you don't get this type of expansion in EVs. Why do we care about more EVs? So that means you get less use of petrol cars, you get less emissions, and a smaller contribution to climate change. How should you weigh this in the round? Climate change affects everyone, particularly those most vulnerable, particularly people in developing countries. It is irreversible. Many of the harms of climate change will continue to accrue into the future because once certain degrees of warming have been reached, it's a tipping point and you can no longer reverse that warming. And finally, it leads to things like natural disasters. It leads to things like droughts. It makes everything far more expensive because it leads to instability in the weather. It harms agriculture. And that is why climate change is just the most certain, but also one of the largest scale impacts in this debate. Cool. What are some more independent benefits other than the fact that we just get more EVs on the road? Number one, you get much more innovation. Loads and loads of new green technology is developed in the process of China's expansion into this market. And that can be used in a lot of different purposes, but also it means there's a massive investment into innovation, which A means you get loads of new innovations that are useful in a wide variety of fields, but a lot of these innovations can lead to downstream scientific discoveries, and a lot of them have come as a result of scientific discoveries subsidized by China, which are just shared with everybody else because that's how science works. Number two, competition. It forces other companies to create more affordable electric vehicles. It forced Tesla to reduce the prices of their cars. It forced Tesla to make them much more accessible because it was losing market share to BYD. Note that Tesla's the only company that could lose market share to BYD because they're the only ones that were pricing their things like a luxury good. Other electric vehicle companies didn't lose market share to BYD. Okay, number three, you create demand for electric vehicles. And that's super important because once people buy an electric vehicle initially, they're unlikely to go back to a petrol car because it's seen as a regression. And also because it disproves a lot of the negative stereotypes people have about electric vehicles that prevent them from buying them in the first place. Things like long charging times, like weaker vehicles. It dispels a lot of those notions, which makes them more inclined to purchase purchase electric vehicles in the future, that means at the point which you've got people to buy their first EV, that's a massive benefit. That means they're likely to buy EVs again, regardless if it's from BYD or another company. And number 4, investment into electric vehicles has increased drastically in every single country, not just China, as a result of China's expansion, because it's a proof that this technology can work. It's a proof that electric vehicle companies can be extremely profitable, as seen in the case of BYD, and it's a proof of concept that encourages investors to invest into this market because they see it as a potential for growth. They see the success story of BYD and are willing to believe that that can be replicated in other areas. And note that all of my mechs on why China is uniquely placed to be the first mover into the electric vehicle market don't necessarily apply to second movers, right? Because a lot of those can benefit from the innovation that has already been done, can benefit from the market share that's already been established, and are able to do things like profit off economies of scale through trade. I'll move on to my final argument on why this isn't a monopoly, but first I'll take the POI from closing. Opening?
You correctly pointed out that this is a war between fuel car and EV car. If BYD is monopolizing, it's really natural that a big traditional company like Toyota will lobby against EV car on your side of the house. We are the side that those corporations are likely to outcompete within EV car industry as well.
So the problem is that as BYD wins market share off of petrol cars, companies like Toyota have to pivot into electric vehicles in order to maintain profitability because petrol cars are representing a smaller and smaller part of the market share. And that's what drives the type of competition I'm telling you is really, really good. So this argument falls down. Okay. Finally, on why this is actually not a monopoly, but all of these arguments are uncontingent on this fact. So even if you believe it's a monopoly, we should just win this debate. 1, you have obviously you have to compete with petrol cars. You can't jack up the price or people go back to petrol cars. So their whole mechanism on price gouging doesn't work. Number 2, there's just many companies in China as a result of this. BYD is one of them, but you also have NIO and XPeng that are also electric vehicle companies existing in China, and you have Tesla in the US, for example. And number 3, why other companies can come in is for the simple fact that we're seeing a growing trend towards isolationism, which means that people prefer to buy goods produced in their own countries. A lot of the messaging is that you should buy local. In the EU, for example, they encourage people to buy products made in the EU. And that's for the simple reason that we're getting this trend towards deglobalization. And what that means is that as soon as those markets close off, new electric vehicle companies are able to fill the demand left by BYD's exit or comparative exit from that market. And also it means there's a massive investment, it's a massive incentive for governments in those countries to encourage investment into EVs locally. And for all of those reasons, very clear OO.
And to begin the closing half of the debate, I'd like to invite up a Gov member. Here.
I just want to check if I'm audible and clear.
Yep.
All right, just give me a minute and I'll get started. First clarification, this is a THBT motion. There's no burden on us to prove a counterfactual. We'll just explain to you why this was a bigger harm than it was a good. Second thing, opening government doesn't explain to you what does crowding out local industries or harming domestic industries look like. What is the impact? What is this looking like? We don't know. We just know it harms domestic industries. First thing we'll do, 3 extensions. First one, filling in the gap in opening. 1, what are the harms to domestic industries being displaced? 1, you need to understand that the Chinese model is one that oftentimes is very self-dependent. This means that they push in their own labor forces, their own investments, their own markets, their own factories. These are everything that's developed by China because they have the capacity to do this. And when they move into new markets, they're entirely self-dependent and they don't usually rely on whatever's happening in the domestic areas as a whole. This means that local companies inherently cannot compete because of the price gaps that exist. They probably have tried, because most of the time local companies operate on the model of getting large amounts of government subsidies to be able to create affordable low-cost EVs for people as a whole, or low-cost vehicles in that of itself. The second, companies like BYD give you a higher spec car for a lower price, regardless of how sustainable is it. The consumers start to subscribe to this more, meaning that 1, a lot of these local companies get screwed over, which means you probably need more forms of government subsidies invested into these companies in order to have them be able to compete, which is a net harm loss you're taking away from these from government funding as a whole in order order to enter into this market where they cannot compete inherently. But secondly, you lose things like job opportunities and etc. You lose things like the ability for you to keep money regulated and circulated in your economy. And this is the biggest harm because China does not keep the money that they profit from within the Malaysian economy or within the Japanese economy. They export it out back to China, which means the biggest bulk of money or the biggest bulk of funding that you're able to get even from encouraging Chinese FDI or encouraging Chinese companies is largely limited. You're stripping the capital away from these nations and causing them to impose a further burden in an industry that you already set unfair standards for them upon. We're proving the harm here to domestic industry and to people on the ground significantly better than our opening. You ought to credit us for this argumentation. Second thing then we want to talk about here, and this is the first new contribution that closing government will give you here, which is why this sets a harmful ethical precedence by the way China operates in terms of the way the industry has occurred in the first place. The first thing here you need to understand is that the Chinese business model relies on a very specific metric, which is low price, mass production, and the fact here was that this was something that began with high levels of competition within China internally because of the big boom of demand that existed for EV or the big interest or perception that this was a valuable marketplace in the first place. What does this mean then? Is that because there were so many companies in China competing in the first place, there was a huge need to compete against one another to create the most effective form of EV or the best marketable EV to export or to create demand for your own product in your market. This means that all EVs need two things. One, lithium. Two, other rare earth minerals that they're powered by. Lies when they tell you that China can just get all of it internally. No, look at the news. Look at the fact that China's actively in Africa, in the Congo, in Zimbabwe, in other different African nations now, currently committing other forms of lithium extraction because these are the countries with the most rich levels of mineral resources that are the easiest and most unregulated for them to tap into. What does this mean then? Because if you look at the precedents that China has set here, the exploitation of lithium within the Congo has oftentimes been some of the most worst ways or most unethical forms of like harvesting for lithium in the first place. Look at the unpaid labor that they use. Look at the unethical ways in which they pull out these particular forms of lithium to power their EV cars in the first place, to import them for a cheap price. The fact that they're able to sidestep regulation, the fact that they're able to lobby and corrupt governments in order to do this, the fact that they exploit individuals on the ground in order to harvest this lithium, which is inherently harmful, are all reasons as to why the production or the model under which China operates to mass pump these productions are things that are fundamentally unethical. But secondly, on an environmental level, the way these forms of lithium are being impacted or being created in the first place are even worse in terms of harms than the benefit that OO gives you of using EV cars. Because firstly, they don't prove urgency. But one, lithium is an extremely volatile material that's extremely environmentally harmful if harvested poorly. The simple essential harm here that we push you is that amidst China's ability to give you proper, cheap, accessible cars, which are questionable in the first place because of their ability to sidestep regulation, you get a lot of prerequisite environmental harms that are being committed in order to get that car on the table in the country that you want in the first place. This means that the competition that existed within China led to a few things. One, companies cutting costs in order to create the cheapest car possible. Two, lobbying governments in order to sidestep regulations on car safety and etc. But thirdly, this is all of the idea to gain and leverage themselves in terms of market share and market capacity in the first place. The last reason here as to why this was the business model that China operated under and that this is extremely hard to regulate. Arguments on op-bench about regulating this are unlikely because one, the average consumer does not have the understanding as to how their products were manufactured. You go to a car dealership, everyone's going to tell you your car is wonderful and perfect in the first place. But two, the price benefit that you get is one that's already actively incentivizing for a lot of consumers. I'm proving to you that along the production line in the first place for China, this already incurs a lot of harm as a whole. Lastly, what are the impacts towards these nations are oftentimes victims of these forms of exploitative mineral harvesting? One, you see a lot of regional instability that exists within these nations like the Congo. You see higher levels of corruption and scheming. You see oftentimes a lot of their capital being flooded out and funded out of their country and not reinvested into their own economies, which leaves them in cripples and trenches. All you have to do to buy this analysis, aside from the 4 layers of Mac I've given you, is to go down to Congo and have a look at yourself. The impact that we give you here is firstly that this sets a terrible precedence of competition, because if opening opposition wants to argue that it is the ability for China to give you cheaper prices that incentivizes other actors to step up their game, we argue too that it's because of China's deceptive methods like this that are able to shock prices so low that other actors who want to compete are likely to take shittier methods like this as well. The impact here is magnitude because of the fact that other countries now opt into unethical practices, further exploitation in the Africas where minerals are prevalent, further exploitation of local labor forces, further poorer forms of mining or cutting costs in order to compete with China on a market level. Their metric of competition is flipping and incurring them significantly more harms. We're proving to you why we're better in that sense. The last part of this then is to explain to you even internally within China, and this is context setting. But before that, go, make this quick.
yeah, like huge amount of MNCs have come into developing country and exploited resources. Do you prefer a world where like, just other countries
So,
come in?
okay, so listen to your own logic. If you say China has the scale to make the most amount of damn cars, then they need the most amount of exploitative lithium, bruh. For your benefit to unlock, you need to make equally as amount of environmental harm. So tell me how many cars China are producing. That's contingent on the environmental harm that you're going to produce then. You don't try and sidestep this, actually defend it. It's like last thing then, on the actual like chronological harm that existed in China. says so much competition in China. Great, they outputted cars. No, there were 300 electric companies in China at the start because of the start of a bubble that was full of investment and competition in the market. The problem here was that this internally created fragmentations within China, the over-competition, the sidestepping of regulations to dominate market share led to further things like child labor exploitation, poorer regulations, bankruptcy among so many people in China because now you have a handful of electric companies left. What does this mean then? A lot of investors got fucked over by this Chinese EV bubble. A lot of investors had to lose funds. A lot of companies went bankrupt. A lot of people lost jobs because of this rapid development in the first place. The impact that we give you on CG is simple. One, we're the better side is protecting the environment because a world without the rapid development would have still seen a gradual development of EVs that still was able to cater to demands. But secondly, we don't set a dangerous competition precedence. But lastly, we explain to you as to why domestic industries don't get screwed over in a way that's actually impacting better than opening government.
Directly going to my extension, why even if BYD is monopolizing the industry currently, why competition may happen in the future? We think that this is really important extension coming from the closing opposition, because I think that the opening opposition's argument is that BYD is being the first mover BYD being the first mover and utilizing the scale of scale of economy or like Chinese support is important for us to spread like EV or whatsoever. Even if we take these kind of cases, we think that if just as the opening government claim, if BYD continues this current monopoly, we think that these kind of benefit that our government side, the opening opposition claim, is not going to exist because of two different reasons. A, because just as the opening government explained, like we think that when this kind of monopoly happen, we think that BYD have less incentive to do innovation in the first place, and therefore we think that these kind of like EV that is going to spread in opposition side of the house, it's not going to be really good one in the first place. Just as the closing government like gave us some concerns about like current EVs, for example, like these kind of like lithium, when they mine this kind of lithium, they just quite exploitative or whatsoever in the first place. But B, we think that this kind of BYD is going to do like price gouging in the long run, even if like currently BYD is quite like cheap company, like BYD have the incentive to price gouge, and in that situation the accessibility of these kind of cars is going to be lost, right? In that situation, we should be the one that uniquely explain why this kind of competition are going to happen, and in that situation why this kind of competition are going to like is going to urge this kind of like BYD not to do this kind of stupid thing, right? I think that the problem with opening opposition was that they did talk about the competition, but what I think that they lacked mechanism, right? Because they just only talked about like China support other EV company as well. It is true, but we say that these kind of other company that China support is quite small company in the first place, and in that situation, even if these kind of small company exists, we think that it is quite difficult for us to pressure these kind of BYD not to do the stupid thing in the first place. Why these kind of competition are going to happen in our side of the house? For 5 different reasons. One, we think that the opening government's arguments about like BYD and China currently dominating the resource mine, for example, lithium or whatsoever, is simply a false in the first place, right? Because note that long time before these kind of electric car have become popular, we think that the lithium was quite used in many purposes. For example, like battery of the smartphones or computer or whatsoever in the first place, right? In that situation, it was impossible for China to dominate every single like lithium mine after they invested BYD in the first place. And in that situation, we say that not only these, maybe some of the mine was dominated by China and BYD, but we think that there are other many mines that is used by other companies in the other countries company in the first place. But 2, we think that the traditional we think that the opening government argument about traditional petrol car company cannot utilize their technology is also lie in the first place, right? This is precisely because it is true that maybe they cannot utilize petrol engine technology, but we think that they have many other technologies that they can utilize for the car to make EVs. For example, we are talking about, for example, technology of like special shape of the car that reduces air resistance and increases the efficiency of the EVs. But also we are also talking about like technology of like suspension technology that makes these kind of like driving comfortable whatsoever in the first place, right? We think that there are many technology that these kind of like traditional petrol car currently have in the first place, and therefore we think that they can utilize this kind of technology to make these good EVs even in our side of the house. But three, we think that in our side of the house, we think that other companies can utilize their strong points in the first place. We think that the strong point that currently BYD currently have is that they can provide this kind of EV car in cheaper price. But we think that the other car company who may used to be like petrol car company also have different strong points. For example, Toyota have that reputation of that high quality cars, but also the Tesla have that reputation of automatic driving and cool shape or whatsoever in the first place. And in that situation, each car company have different branding in the first place, and therefore they'll be able to cater to different buyer in the first place. But fourthly, we think that the EV, just as the opening comment said, EV are currently facing many technical difficulties. For example, short driving range or whatsoever in the first place. And in that situation, when these kind of problems are solved by some company, we think that this kind of company that solve this kind of problem can easily override BYD in the first place. But fifthly and most importantly, second mover advantage in the first place, right? We think that the first Rabbit, it is true that first Rabbit have some benefit, but we think that the first Rabbit also have to use a huge advertisement fee to normalize this kind of new technology, that is to say EV in the first place. They have to say EV is really good. They have to use huge money to say that huge money to us by saying EV is safe or whatsoever, right? In that situation, second mover can just enter to the industry after everybody is widely accepting this kind of EV in the first place, and therefore we think that this kind of marketing fee that they have to use, they have to use is smaller in the first place, and therefore we think that this kind of second mover advantage also exists. And in that situation, we think that the competition by other Toyota or Toyota or Tesla or whatsoever, future competition by these kind of Toyota or Tesla against these kind of BYD is quite plausible. Before moving on, yes, opening.
Yeah, isn't it easier for petrol car manufacturers that are currently losing the competition against BYD to just lobby the government so that they can continue to sell their petrol cars rather than investing in expensive R&D that is at best speculative on your side of the house?
A, if that's the case, most of your argument dies out. But B, we think that in many of the developing nations where they have car companies, presumably there's trend of transitioning to EVs or whatsoever, resource resource engine cars in the first place, and therefore we think that this kind of bargaining is quite difficult in the first place. But lastly, about the impacting, right? We think that in our side of the house, we think that the EVs are going to be accessed more cheaply. We think that this is not only important for the environment purposes, but also to the citizen on the ground, right? Because what we have to notice here is that EV currently there's trend of EV being mandatory in many of the nations. For example, in nation level, we think that the many developed nations started to ban this kind of petrol car. For example, in UK or in Paris City or whatsoever in the first place. But also in terms of company level, right? It is kind of trend that many developed nations, many MNCs in developed nations cares about ESG or carbon tax, and therefore they forces their vendors company to also align with these kind of green tech, eco-friendly policies in the first place. Right? In that situation, they forces other their vendor companies to also use these kind of eco-friendly cars or whatsoever in the first place. Right? In that situation, even in also the company level, this kind of mandatory transition to EV is also happening, right? In that situation, the problem is, although they are coerced to use EV, because when EVs are expensive, they cannot use these kind of they cannot buy these kind of cars in the first place, and in that situation, access to the car is quite prerequisite for any benefit to happen in the first place. And in that situation, we think these kind of benefits going to be assured in our side of the house by all of these reasons opposed.
Thank you, member, for
Let's talk about cheap cars, because both op benches want to win on this. I think CEO's extension is mechanism as to why the innovation is likely going to happen and why the quality of the cars can be maintained. I don't think this was necessary in the debate. I think O reproves it quite sufficiently, and I'll wait to you why. I'll just frame this argument out and explain to you why innovation isn't an important factor to engage with anyway. OD's response to the whole claim on trickle-down benefits and cheap cars is that they say the cars themselves are inherently bad and that it disrupts local markets. This isn't sufficient strategically within the debate because there's no explanation from them as to why the other industries simply cannot innovate to make cars better in the face of the abundance of analysis you get from CEO, if you want to credit all of that. And there's no analysis why they cannot preserve their own dominance within these nations as well. Things that O correctly points out. What this response will do to you is highlight why the access has come at a cost of other people's access to cars, individuals who are far more vulnerable stakeholders in nations that really need to be able to sell these cars, and why the environmental cost is one that is so great and detrimental that it simply isn't worth it, even if it means that EV cars have lesser emissions and we adopt them at a massive scale globally, which is a prospective benefit that we haven't seen yet. I'm not sure how well that fits into the burden expectations of this debate, because it's a belief that something in the past has done more harm than good. So it has to be retrospective. We haven't seen the global adoption yet, so probably shouldn't credit that argument to the extent that they claim. How does the material and province speech engage with this clash? First, China's EV cars have broken into nations that need to have thriving local car production economies. So these aren't nations like Japan or Korea with their Toyotas and their Hyundais, but rather developing countries with significant subsidized car industries. So Proton and Perodua in Malaysia, Wintech in Vietnam, Tata in India, for instance. These industries are important because they need to be able to provide cheap but sustainable cars for the rural poor. So the nature of these cars is that they're quite low tech. You don't have fancy radios, you don't have really good working aircons. They just do the bare minimum, and they can easy to replace parts, and they can survive really harsh weather conditions that these nations experience as well. These nations need people to buy the cars en masse, so you need it to be their number one choice when it comes to consumer selection, so that this creates a strong flow of money from the consumers back into the government, who's going to subsidize these cars as well. So you can justify how much money you put into subsidizing them, and then you can create an economy of scale so that the cars become really cheap for people as well. Why do EVs screw this over? First, you provide really cheap cars in the form of EVs. If you buy the analysis from the op bench to be true, I don't think it is, but let's engage with this since it's an accepted factor in the debate anyway. They're not very sustainable because of the bad innovative nature of battery technology, but the thing is they appear quite stylish, they appear quite modern, and these EV companies are incentivized to market them as such through the comfort and things like that as well, because they know that the battery sustainability isn't a very strong selling suit of them. So this incentivizes buyers from the lower middle class in order for them to buy these EV cars instead that appear a lot more luxurious but are still quite affordable, as opposed to just going for the cheap national subsidized cars that these countries already provide for you. This is bad for the person who's buying these cars, because in the long run, it means they're probably going to have to spend more money in purchasing new cars or more expensive parts, or just difficulty in being able to access charging ports and things like that. But more importantly, the established subsidized industries in the nation suffer because demand just isn't the same. This is important because they still have to provide to the really poor who cannot afford these BYDs, who cannot afford these whatever other EV cars, and rely on these subsidized cars in order for them to have basic forms of transportation. This is bad because it drives you force these nations to drive the prices of their existing cars down, which means that the nation has to subsidize more of it, which means the nation is spending money that they otherwise could have spent elsewhere to distribute social welfare or anything else. But more importantly than that, you force them to waste money developing EV tech, which isn't very sustainable for them in the first place because they don't have access towards the rare earth minerals that are necessary for you to successfully develop them. But the tech development itself is one that's extremely expensive, and these nations have historically been quite unsuccessful in doing so. Look at the attempts in Malaysia and Vietnam for the national cars to try and adopt EV vehicles, which are quite bad, which have also ruined the rep of EV vehicles in the long run and ruined the rep of these national subsidized cars in the first place as well. This flips OO completely because it proves why the cheap access is actually harmful, and it proves why innovation is one that is too costly and unattainable. So it frames out the entire extension that comes out from CO, which we just don't see materialized in this world, which is an important burden to fulfill in a retrospective debate. This takes out, so it takes out CO as well. Second, on the environmental harms and the political harms that happens from the countries that they source this from. To make EVs, you need rare earth minerals so that they can go into the batteries, so that you can recharge them and you can produce them. These are only available in some parts of the world, like the Congo, Central Africa, and Burundi. This is empirically true, but if you want structural reasons, think about all the nations in the world with the massive capacity to adopt EV cars, but haven't been able to do so because they don't have access to the mines in these countries, and it's quite difficult for them to access them in terms of being able to trade for them as well because of how rare and valuable they are. What does China do in the Congo to fuel its rapid expansion? Their incentive analysis here is that they want to make it really cheap because they want to make it affordable to everybody in their own country so that they can adopt it en masse, and they want to do it really fast as well because they want to catch up on all the technological progress that Tesla has had decades ahead of them. This means that they intentionally destabilize the region so that they can harvest lithium far better. This looks like giving money to terrorists, giving money to insurgent groups, and have them go and claim the territories in the DRC, claim territories in Central Africa, so that they can go there and take over the mines and they can harvest the lithiums a lot better as well. China funds them in exchange for exclusive and cheaper access to the mines. So there's a relationship that they have in terms of that results in a destabilization of the region and results in China getting cheaper access to these things as well. But the process of massive adoption has meant that China has imposed massive quotas on the mines as well, meaning that laborers have to work in worse conditions. You have to work them for longer hours. This is how you end up with child laborers in these mines working longer hours to fulfill these quotas as well. And these nations end up depleting their resources. I'll take opening.
If there is a significant reduction of EV user on the US side, people drive petroleum cars still rely on cheap labor to extract petrol from developing countries.
I'll weigh against this. Let's weigh exactly that. The first is that China doing these in these nations has incentivized other actors to do similar things. So the US wants to do similar things, Russia wants to do similar things in nations that they have control over. They fund terrorist groups, they fund insurgent groups to destabilize the region on purpose. This means that the US has renewed incentive to go to war with Venezuela as well because of rare earth minerals that they contain. So OO's analysis of how everyone is going to innovate and the outcomes that CEO relies on all are contingent on this harm happening, which means the extent of harm that happens to these already very vulnerable stakeholders, children, innocent people, becomes a lot worse. Let's weigh against the environment because that's a silver bullet. They say EV cars are good, we need more of them. The first response is just that there are other ways to deal with the environment. Car emissions don't make up the majority in terms of how badly things affect the environment and global warming. That's to do with corporations and the way that they emit carbon dioxide and things like that. But their principle here is premised on, if they had actually proven it, premised on protecting people and protecting the vulnerable stakeholders and not harming the environment more. This is precisely what they don't achieve in the way that China has harvested all of these things historically in the past, the way that have empirically done it as well, and the way that we proved to you other nations are going to continue doing these things if they haven't done so already. Which means that the premise of the principle that they try to rely on is something that they don't prove, but we showed you why there's a harm that they have to engage with, that they have nothing to preempt against. Very clear, CG.
Yep, thank you. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Team by team comparison. Firstly, team by team comparison, firstly, opening opposition, secondly, government CG, and thirdly, OG. But along the way, I'm going to recap our extension and impact our claim as well. Firstly, opening opposition. Obviously, we agree with directionality of their case, but there are two major flaws in that case. First of all, is that they are vulnerable to government's pushback, that the quality is going to be lower, or no one really buys EVs on our side of house. That's going to be really expensive. DLO tried to claim that the competition within China happens. There are a bunch of other small corporations, and that they are going to reduce prices, or there are regulations, or like Tesla has to reduce prices on our side of house, something like that. They consider that small corporations, competitors are small corporations, and BYD can still win over them. I didn't really clearly see the reason why BYD has to decrease prices to that significant extent. Also, I didn't really see why regulation is gonna be so strong. As CG points out, CCP, OG and CG points out, CCP is probably going to call this strategic industry of the country and has no incentive to intervene massively. Yeah, in that kind of situation, OO was assertive as to why competition, why this type of, why quality is going to be decent, why the car is likely to be accessible. And we gave you 5 different reasons as to why competition is decently likely to happen, right? There are other aspects in EV car creation that other companies can mimic. Even if they are not specialized in EV car creation, they can utilize other technology from petrol cars, for example, and apply that to EV car creation. And for that reason, I think we fulfill the important mech of OO. But secondly, even if you do not buy all of that, right? Even if you believe CG saying that the CEO has no analysis or something like that, OO impact was at best like small delta in this debate. And here I just want to frame out opening half as a whole. So opening half talked about environment, right? But probably the extent to which you can change the environment is less visible compared to other harms. This is for 3 reasons. Firstly, it's because there are other ways to better the situation of environment. Like we have technology to put carbon dioxide back into its solid form or things like that. And 2 is that, as CG points out correctly, lithium electricity or technology that EV car necessarily needs is also bad for environment, we would say. And thirdly, is that there are other ways to reduce carbon dioxide, like doing replacing fire plant with renewable energy or like that. What I'm trying to do here is that I just wanted to say that the environment factors can be alternated by other ways, which means that the environment is probably the least important impact in this debate. The reason why our impact is more important is because we care more, we create larger delta. Specifically, what kind of actor do we defend? We defend actors that have to use EV cars, that have to buy EV cars because of the international trend, but cannot afford that on their side of house. Who are they, right? Firstly, is that why do you have to use cars? Firstly, is that there are international trends, for example, in developed nations to ban hybrid car or ban petrol cars and forces developing country vendor to utilize EV cars. This looks like UK banning developing country vendors to use vendors to use petrol cars and only select vendors that can afford EV cars or like that. Also, secondly, on company level, Apple require their vendors to use EV cars. This looks like they require logistic companies from Mexico to buy EV trucks as opposed to petrol trucks. And those companies who cannot afford all of those things will lose out in the competition, cannot access the money that Apple provides, all of those things, right? They have to, in order to win contracts, they have to buy EV cars. The reason why EV car is unlikely to be accessible on their side of house is that Tesla is going to hijack the prices. It's simply that, firstly, EV car is not really normalized. No one really produces EV cars. Yes, there are some companies creating, but they can slack off because they're already monopolizing the industry, which means that this type of car is likely to be very expensive, no incentive to reduce prices. Also, secondly, is that they focus on richer consumers, which means they don't really fucking care about developing countries. The other people, they can afford ignoring developing country demand because they can focus on their own country's richer consumers. This is, I think, the largest delta impact in this debate. And that's the reason why we win over opening half. But secondly, closing up, right? So CG impact was twofold. First of all, is that they said this is going to take away jobs from local workers in the West. I have two responses. First of all, is that China has to create factories in West on our side of house, obviously, because creating factories in China and transporting it to the West is gonna be incredibly expensive. Transportation cost is gonna be fucking accumulating, which means that they are likely to create factories in Japan, in the US on our side of house. The job is not going to be taken away. They are going to employ local workers. Secondly, is that the Tesla factory can be built in China, and Tesla utilizing this massive EV industry in China and making money out of it and sending money back to the West in the form of tax, for example, means that they will be able to enrich country on our side of the house. Second extension from CG was to say, China is going to exploit the developing countries or things like that. Obvious response here is that Tesla exploits this developing country as well. Thank you. Intuition here is that the Uniqlo in their fast fashion industry exploited Vietnamese sweatshops, and they exploited Kenyan children or things like that. Just because you're West doesn't mean you do not exploit people. And West countries are worse than China in terms of exploitation because they cannot use scale merit. They cannot cheaply create cars, which means they have to cut costs somewhere else. They have to cut labor costs, right? They have to exploit more workers on their side of house. China can utilize scale merit, which means that they are able to, they do not have to cut down labor costs. So this symmetrizes causing government impact as a whole. They say that the developing country workers are the most vulnerable, but if they cannot save them on their side of house, this impact really doesn't make any sense. We have larger delta. Lastly, opening government, right? OG problem is that they are uncomparative, right? They didn't really talk about how Tesla is going to be able to create EV cars on their side of house. They say that the Tesla is going to have some time to get ready for EV car creation. Unclear why they have incentive, especially why they have incentive to create cheap cars. They only focus on rich consumers, as I've already talked about. Or they only focus on design and don't really care about quality or all of those stuff. For all of those reasons, we are the team providing delta oppose.
Cool. I like